After our father passed away, our wealthy mother raised my sisters and me all by herself. Incidentally, I have a brother who had become estranged from our mother due to his deep involvement in gambling. One day, our mother suddenly passed away from a heart attack. My brother, who was overjoyed by our mother's death and plotted to monopolize the $7 million inheritance, was shocked by the astonishing truth revealed by the lawyer. While working as an ordinary office worker, I lived with my mother and sister. My mother, a well-known wealthy individual, raised me, my sister, and my brother, who now lives elsewhere, alone after our father's death years ago. My mother wisely managed the vast fortune inherited from our grandparents, striving to increase the wealth to secure our future. Although my father was a quiet man, he was caring towards the family, worked hard without relying on my mother's wealth, and supported her in her financial endeavors. Unfortunately, my father met with an unforeseen accident while driving and was in a hopeless state when taken to the hospital. It was then that my mother resolved to raise the three of us by herself. To ensure our livelihood, she further deepened her knowledge in asset management and invested her passion. However, the fact remains that after our father's death, our comfortable lives, university education, and becoming independent adults were largely due to the savings and insurance money he left behind, not just our mother's wealth. My mother's assets steadily increased, but I heard that our lifestyle was not extraordinary and the monthly living expenses were almost on par with that of a normal dual-income family. Then, one day, after all of us had become independent adults, my sister was suddenly involved in an accident. She was not unconscious and regained consciousness soon after being taken to the hospital, but unfortunately, she was left with severe aftereffects. My sister became paraplegic and was forced to live in a wheelchair. Recently, I have not been particularly involved in a romantic relationship or felt a strong desire for career advancement. After my sister's accident and her resulting disabilities, I decided to cancel my apartment lease and return to our family home to take care of her. Despite her inability to move as before the accident, my sister always kept smiling and lived positively. Although there were limitations to what she could do by herself, my mother and I supported her, and she was always genuinely grateful. We respected my sister's wishes, supporting her to do as much as she could by herself, and only subtly offering help when she truly needed it. My mother used part of her assets to remodel our house for wheelchair accessibility. However, our peaceful life persisted only during the periods when our brother was not at home. Our eldest brother, who went to university, changed after becoming an adult and became deeply involved in gambling. He managed to graduate from university without any delays but didn't find employment and lived off part-time jobs. Our mother never tolerated our brother's poor money management after going to university and remained stern whenever he came to borrow money. Our brother seldom returned home after realizing he couldn't use our mother's wealth for himself, but he would always appear at our doorstep whenever he was in trouble, like rent arrears or utility cutoffs. When my sister had the accident, we didn't inform our brother. In reality, he rarely came home, and even when he did, he would just borrow money from our mother and quickly leave. We felt no need to share my sister's condition with him. However, one day, while the three of us were living together and supporting each other, our brother suddenly returned home. Hey, the house has completely changed while I was away. He carefully looked around the house, now remodeled for easy wheelchair movement, and muttered to himself. Neither my mother nor I, and certainly not my sister, did anything to forcefully drive our brother away, but he seemed completely oblivious to the cold attitude we had towards him. My brother, unconcerned, barged into our mother's study. After a while, he emerged from the room with a sullen face, and our mother sent a glaring look at his back from inside the room. I went to my mother's room and asked her after closing the door. Did brother come again to ask for money? In response to my question, my mother slowly nodded while sighing. It was clear that my brother had come home just to borrow money. My mother, of course, refused his request, which resulted in his sullen demeanor. The relationship between my mother and brother had been deteriorating over the past few years, and the scene I had just witnessed was not the first of its kind. I had seen it several times before. My mother had a look of deep concern, furrowing her brow. Downstairs, my brother sat on the sofa, crossing his legs and looking irritated. I, of course, supported my mother's stance and had no intention of offering any special help to my brother. He usually left home the same day if he didn't get help from our mother, but this time, he stayed for several days, which was unusual. I quietly suspected he was planning something or perhaps had been driven out of his own place. The atmosphere at home was clearly worsening each day with him around. My sister seemed quieter than usual, trying to maintain a cheerful facade despite the tension. One night, as we were living with this strained relationship, I found my mother collapsed in her room. My sister was in her room, and my brother was relaxing in the living room. Before calling them, I immediately requested an ambulance. As the siren of the ambulance was heard, my sister rushed out of her room. Seeing our mother being carried on a stretcher, she looked anxious. My brother showed up in the hallway for a moment when the paramedics entered, but for some reason, he quickly retreated back into his room. Knowing that no one else could accompany my mother in the ambulance, I told my sister to wait at home and hurried into the ambulance, temporarily pushing aside my concerns about my brother's strange behavior. An hour later, my mother passed away in the hospital she was taken to. The doctor said the cause was a heart attack. When I returned home to inform my sister of our mother's sudden death, she was speechless from shock. I tried to stay calm while observing her reaction. As my sister broke down in tears, I comforted her, stroking her back. However, as his siblings, we had to inform our brother of this sad news. I went to the living room where my brother was resting. "Brother, I need to talk to you." I knocked on the door and entered without waiting for a response. It seemed my brother had gone out while I was at the hospital, as the room was empty. He might have returned to his own home, or perhaps he was wandering around and wouldn't return for several days. Thinking he couldn't have gone far, I hurriedly called him to inform him of our mother's sudden death. Then, my brother started talking loudly about the inheritance. His confident tone about the distribution of the inheritance deeply disappointed me. "Mom just died, and you sound almost happy about it." Realizing my clear anger, my brother casually replied that he was not happy and quickly ended the call. My brother seemed self-centered, indifferent to other people's feelings and situations. I didn't want such a person involved in the preparations for the funeral of the mother who had raised us so well. I decided to start preparing for the funeral on my own. With my sister's help, I began arranging a family funeral. Fortunately, everything went smoothly, and we managed to get through it by supporting each other. However, even though I didn't feel like I was exerting myself too much, deep down, I was slowly reaching my limit. Then, the day of the funeral arrived. I reminisced about my memories with my mother, unable to stop my tears. My sister also stared at the portrait, lost for words. Even though she was alive and well just a few days ago, my mother's departure was so sudden that the reality of her passing hadn't sunk in yet. As my sister and I, drowning in sorrow, leaned on each other, my brother appeared from behind. Next to him stood an unfamiliar woman, dressed in mourning clothes. I haven't mentioned this before, but actually, I'm married. Suddenly, he declared this, and then shouted loudly, "I'll be taking the $7 million inheritance and the company mother left. Don't worry, I'll leave you the wheelchair-bound sister, haha." My sister and I were speechless at our brother's sudden words, and we could only silently watch as the woman who seemed to be his wife followed him quietly. At the funeral venue, besides my sister and me, there was no one else. Only the footsteps of my brother and his wife echoed in the quiet space. Aside from the unexpected arrival of my brother and his wife, Mother's funeral proceeded smoothly. My brother, who continued his disrespectful behavior even at the funeral venue, aimed for the inheritance and had been coming to borrow money. And his wife, who had never greeted our family before, lacked any semblance of politeness. I wanted to sever ties with these two as soon as possible. My brother had always looked down on my sister, who had become disabled from the accident, treating her like nothing more than a nuisance rather than offering support or sympathy. After the funeral ended and life began to stabilize, I decided to meet with a lawyer to discuss the inheritance. I found the lawyer's business card in my mother's desk drawer, indicating that she had probably been making arrangements about her estate before her death. I visited the law firm to learn the details, and the information the lawyer revealed was unexpected. The inheritance was only for my sister and me. My brother was excluded. It seemed he had thought he would get everything, but the lawyer showed me the will left by our mother. My brother was not included in the inheritance, and he couldn't assume the position of president of the company my mother had been secretly managing. I sighed in relief as I returned home. When I showed the will to my sister, she was as surprised as I was. We distributed the inheritance as per the will and continued our lives as usual. 5 days later, my brother called me, sounding half frantic. Over the phone, I could hear a woman shouting in the background. It seemed that he had just learned that he wouldn't receive any inheritance and was utterly confused. "It's impossible that I don't get any inheritance. Explain this to me. Where is the $7 million? What happened to the company I was supposed to inherit?" His angry shouts were incessant, and my ears couldn't take it anymore, so I hung up without a word. When he called again, I decided to explain the will to him. I told him about my meeting with the lawyer and that our mother had left a will, explicitly excluding him from the inheritance. My brother became even more furious and panicked. I realized that communicating with my brother, who had become like a monster, and the woman who seemed to be his wife, constantly screaming, was futile. I ended the call, intending not to speak with my brother anymore. He called me several times after that, but I never responded, and he seemed to have given up eventually. In contrast, my inbox started filling up with emails from him. Of course, I didn't reply to the emails and just observed the situation. Gradually, the emails from my brother began to show irritation, with one saying, "I'm coming back home, so don't resist and wait for me." Considering his recent deep involvement in gambling and his increasingly violent nature, especially with the large inheritance and company at stake, I feared he might ransack the house in anger, so I quickly called the police. "There is an unknown person yelling outside my home. Can you please help?" Before my brother arrived, I hurriedly locked the back door, put a chain on the front door for safety, and closed all the windows with curtains. My sister understood the situation and hid in her room. After a while, I began to hear my brother's angry shouts from outside. When he realized the door wouldn't open, he seemed to be venting his anger at the entrance, occasionally kicking the door and causing a commotion. I was surprised at how quickly my brother had changed, but I was determined not to let him into the house. Amidst his rampage, his wife was also incessantly shouting something. While their mad voices echoed outside, my sister and I just continued to endure patiently inside the house. However, at the same time as my brother and his wife arrived at our house, the police also showed up. The couple was taken away by the police, and after being interrogated at the police station, they received a stern warning and never appeared at our house again. Even after that, my brother continued to call and email me asking for money, but I decided not to respond at all. Gradually, his attempts to contact me decreased and eventually stopped. My sister also received similar calls, and surprisingly, she responded to one of them, fiercely scolding my brother. After that incident, my brother stopped showing any reaction to my sister. I was shocked myself to see my usually cheerful and easygoing sister getting angry at our brother. He must have been very surprised by her attitude. I was able to vent everything I had been holding back. "Now, I feel truly refreshed," my sister said with a satisfied expression. Since then, my brother and his wife never showed up at our house again, and my sister and I truly became partners, supporting each other in every step. My sister and I still live in our family home. As I felt even when my mother was alive, the house was too big for just the two of us sisters to live in. We considered moving out together since there was a chance that my brother and his wife might barge in again, but we decided to continue living in our family home, which our mother had taken care of, for my sister's sake. We were able to cut ties with my brother and his wife without any issues. Later, I heard through the grapevine that my brother had quit his part-time job as soon as he heard about our mother's sudden death. He had not been working much due to his gambling addiction, but he was still making enough to pay his cheap apartment rent. However, believing that he would receive the entire $7 million inheritance, he did not try to restart his part-time job or look for new employment. Without the inheritance and having quit his job, he didn't break free from his gambling addiction and continues to the casino. Unable to receive a single yen of the inheritance, he was forced into a life of poverty in his apartment, and eventually, his wife left him, leading to their divorce. Initially, his wife had approached him with the simple motive of marrying someone who seemed to be successfully gambling and living a wealthy life, hoping to live comfortably as a housewife with access to whatever she wanted. She met my brother when he had some financial flexibility, but with no steady job and no inheritance from our mother, he continued to lose at gambling and accumulate debts, leading his wife to feel staying with him was a risk, and she decided to divorce. As for myself, I quit my previous job and decided to take over the company that my mother had been managing. I'm still inexperienced, but I'm working hard every day with the help of many people. Meanwhile, my sister, though still in a wheelchair, has no issues with her upper body and has recently started trying her hand at administrative work from home. The inheritance from our mother was indeed substantial, but we decided to live our lives independently, relying on our own efforts rather than depending on the inheritance.